Well, hello, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host and fellow listener and viewer. We have a lot going on here at The Sacred Speaks, so I'm going to introduce you to today's participant, let you know some housekeeping details, and also what's in store for the next maybe 3 or 4 months for The Sacred Speaks. So I'll get started. I'll try to make it as quick as possible. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Edward Bever, and I'll begin by reading his bio just so we don't delay, because this was fun. Edward Bever earned a PhD in history from Princeton University and is professor of history and director of the School of Professional Studies at SUNY Old Westbury. He specializes in the history of magic and witchcraft, is the author of The Realities of Witchcraft and Popular Magic in Early Modern Europe, Culture, Cognition, and Everyday Life from 2008. That is this book. It was magical. Fantastic. Let's see. And then he's and co-editor of Magic in the Modern World, Strategies of Repression and Legitimization, which is the book we really talked about today. Contributed chapters to the Oxford Handbook of Witchcraft in Early Modern Europe and Colonial America, The Rutledge History of Witchcraft and Emotions in the History of Witchcraft, and published articles on the topics in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History, the Journal of Social History and Magic, Ritual, and Witchcraft. He is essentially a knowledgeable fellow when it comes to the subject matter of magic and witchcraft. And it expanded my mind and sent me in a lot of great directions, so more to come on magic and witchcraft in the podcast. And thanks, Ed. Thanks for your time. Okay, so got a lot going on regarding interviews. I'm going to try to get through as many as I can. So we've Deborah Deep Mouton is coming up. She just wrote a book called Black Chameleon, and it's a fantastic re-envisioning of certain mythological themes in her development, memoir-esque, but also looking at the way mythology plays a part in our development and the narrativization of our stories in our individual histories and our also collective histories. It was a fantastic conversation. We've got an interview with Hunt Priest and Jessica Felix Romero coming up from Ligare, but also Sojourner, and that was fantastic. Upcoming interviews, Rachel Harris, her book Swimming in the Sacred. Rachel is so lovely. I can't wait to talk to her again. I interviewed her a while back and am eager to connect again. Her book Swimming in the Sacred, Wisdom from the Psychedelic Underground, is coming out very soon. I am eager to talk to her. She talks to a number of elders in the tradition, female elders in the tradition, ayahuasca primarily. And I've just always been a fan of Rachel, so I'm eager to chat. Mary Casamano from Johns Hopkins. She is the director of Guide and Facilitator Services. And I'm at Johns Hopkins in their, the director of Guide Facilitator Services at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. Very eager to chat with her. Her reputation precedes her. My colleague and friend Tony Bossis certainly anoints her as a lovely human being. I'm eager to chat. And then we've got Eric Davis in the Ian McGilchrist, Bea Gonzalez from Sophia's Cycle. I'm really eager to chat with her. We haven't landed on a date yet, but we're going to soon. And Thomas Moore is going to be coming back onto the podcast. So a lot going on, and those are just a few. I've got a number of folks I'm in conversation with, so really lining up the calendar for The Sacred Speaks. So thanks for hanging in. Thanks for connecting, for commenting, for sharing, for all your support. Really appreciate it. It's what keeps this engine turning. Just to hit a couple of details, check out The Sacred Speaks at thesacredspeaks.com. Website's out. It's running. It's fantastic. I've been loving it. Music, check it out at the end of every episode. The theme song for the podcast is Clouds from a group called Modern Nations. Check them out at modernnationsmusic.com. As always, check out the Young Center in Houston. I'm on the board, and I'm very involved with what the Young Center brings to the Houston community, but we offer a lot of classes online, so you can reach what the Young Center does from anywhere in the world. younghouston.org is their website. Got a little bit of cool action coming up. We are going to be going back to Esalen in October Rodney Waters and I to teach a class on ecstatic experience music in Jung's Red Book. It'll be a little bit similar to what we did earlier in the year, but we're going to change it up and refine it a bit. So if you were at our previous workshop, come on back. If you're looking to do something in October, I'll give you dates pretty soon, but we'll be back. And as always, it's great to be out at Esalen. I think that does it for now. Yeah. As I'm thinking through, I don't think there's anything else. Oh, there is something else. If anybody is out there looking for a job as a therapist, the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences, our sponsor in the boutique integrative wellness practice that my wife and I started many moons ago, we're hiring a new therapist. So if you know anybody, send them our direction. Check us out at thecenterforhas.com. Links below to all of these endeavors. And thank you for your continued support. Thanks for sharing it. And thanks for all the participants who continue to show up and allow me to pick their brains. So thank you all. And for now, we'll leave it there. Edward Bever, very good to see you again. And this is our what do we call a makeup match? It's a
round two.
Round two, yeah. For those of y'all out there, we took a first dip, but it's really nice when you can connect with somebody and go, hey, there was more there than the time allotted. So we kind of put a pause on it and regrouped, and then that gave me the opportunity to read another one of your books, an edited volume. We're talking about two books today: Magic in the Modern World. Links below, of course. Strategies of Repression and Legitimization, edited by Edward Bever and Randall Stiers. And then also your book here, The Realities of Witchcraft and Popular Magic in Early Modern Europe, Culture, Cognition, and Everyday Life. Thanks for both of these. How are you today, man?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
Good.
And you?
I'm well, thanks.
Good.
I'm eager to dig into this, the conversation of witchcraft and magic. And I just had a conversation with Jeffrey Kripal, a friend and colleague in this territory. We were talking about his new book, The Superhumanities, and looking at his understanding. I love Jeff's metaphor for like we're all mutants. You know, magic is just in our veins, in our blood, and in our experience. We've just misunderstood what magic is. So to dig into this with you, I'm excited. And I think one of the things we can just start with is that general question: what is magic? And to use your title, what is magic in the modern world? And if I could, I want to quote. I want to quote from you or whomever wrote this, and you can riff on this, of course. I've got about maybe 5 quotes just to sprinkle into our conversation. In its many forms, magic explicitly foregrounds questions concerning the nature of the self and its boundaries, the capacities of the will, and the relation of the self to external powers. When magic is suppressed, the self is conceived and performed largely as physically isolated and internally directed. The self is constrained into narrow modes of agency and power. When magic is embraced, the self is seen in far more expansive terms as organically interconnected with and permeated by various aspects of the external world. The capacities of the self are understood as participating in a broad network of material and spiritual forces. The choice between suppressing and embracing magic turns on fundamentally different understandings of the nature of the self, its boundaries, and its powers. Good stuff. So let's dig into that around what is magic and culture and psychology, and just take that and see where we go.
Well, I guess at its core, to me, magic is, how do I put it? Well, let me take a step back from it. Shamanism is closely linked with magic, and I really like to focus more on shamanism because it's easier to talk about what it is without sort of being reductionist and without bumping into the many things that have been called magic in different ways. I remember talking with a bunch of undergraduates, and I was talking about Mirandello and the Renaissance philosopher and the relationship of what he was doing with magic. And in the end of toward the end of the class, it became clear to me from what one of the students was saying that they all understood magic to be stage magic. So
Right.
why was the professor talking about, magicians getting up there and pulling rabbits out of hats and stuff, you know? And I'm thinking about something entirely different. So to start with shamanism, I mean, shamanism to me is, and I put it out in the book, is altering the functioning of your nervous system to tap powers and knowledge that are not accessible in normal waking consciousness. And to me, this issue of consciousness is central because consciousness is both an epiphenomenon and a driver of neurological activity. And it's that neurological activity. And I guess one of the basic assumptions I have is if you're using your nervous system for one thing, you're not using it for another. So if you're using it to sleep, you're not awake. If you are using it to focus on a whole bunch of day-to-day tasks immediately in front of you, you're not sitting back and contemplating the meaning of life or the universe, or letting yourself be open to thoughts and feelings that well up from deep inside of you because your brain is too busy juggling all of these things. And I mean, without any scientific real basis for it, I think alpha waves, which dominate and beta waves that dominate our normal waking consciousness, right? They are because our brains are doing so many things at once and multitasking and jumping from this thing to that thing. Whereas the long, slow waves that characterize meditative states and deep sleep are because our brains are not managing lots and lots of different thoughts at once and
Hmm.
bouncing between them. And so I think a lot of my understanding of magic hinges on this what I call tuning or fine tuning the nervous system. Unfortunately, the phrase tuning the nervous system was taken over by the people who deal with the driving of the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system to a state of overflow where you get both of them functioning at the same time and this ecstatic state that comes out of that. And so that's tuning the nervous system as sort of this gross um, dry use of the nervous system in a very particular and powerful and overwhelming way. But then I think of magic involving that, and that's the core of shamanism as I understand it. But in addition to that, there's what I call shamanistic activity, which is much more subtle and limited tunings of the nervous system to that also produce magical effects. And one example I'd have would be the subliminal communication of hostility that people do naturally that triggers a stress response in somebody else. And that's kind of the core of witchcraft, is that somebody can spontaneously project their anger through various facial, facial expressions, gestures, tone of voice, all these non-linguistic ways of expressing anger, and that triggers a stress response in other people. And again, it's linguistic, but it's not just linguistic because I don't know if you have studied mirror neurons at all, but 20% of the neurons in your arm that are connected with lifting something up fire when you see somebody lift something up. I'm making the 20% up, but it's something like that. And so there is this sort of unconscious visceral interaction. I mean, I guess I'll be honest, my father was a Freudian psychiatrist. And so I always see everyday life as this intimate dance that we play with everybody that we come into face-to-face
Hmm.
contact with, where we are signaling to them on all different levels about things. I mean, they've shown studies of where people's eyes go when they come into a room and confront somebody else. And there's a lot of sexuality in that, as I understand it.
Yeah.
So Freud was onto something there. The first thing people do is check each other out as sexual partners or competitors, and this happens unconsciously and automatically, and it influences the way we feel about people. It's not the sole determinant of how we feel about people, but it influences how we feel about people. So that kind of unconscious, to me, that kind of unconscious interaction is connected with magic. I don't know if I want to say it's a form of magic, but when it gets to the point where somebody gets sick, then it goes from being just ordinary unconscious interplay with other people to a kind of magic that you have tapped this power you have to influence someone else's health by
Mm.
expressing your emotions toward them, and it can be used positively too. I mean, a lot of healing traditions mobilize psychological forces, and people do things, rituals that foster community and connection and support. And all of these things have unconscious meanings to people that can influence their recovery. And on the other side of that is witchcraft, which is using the same basic processes or the same similar kinds of connections to project anger and hostility and malice. And I guess I would say it becomes magic at the point that it actually works, that it actually either causes an effect outside of you, or it taps in in a divination, it taps in a kind of knowledge or an awareness that you didn't have before, by becoming sensitive to your own unconscious understanding of things in a way that you don't become conscious of in normal daily life. You are influenced by those things, you're driven by them sometimes, or you're channeled by them. But when you stop and have a vision, that's magic, because that's now become a conscious part of your knowledge, not an unconscious influence on it.
Hmm.
So you can see how I sort of uh, you know, I guess I reject the idea that magic is sort of a residual category of all those things we can't understand that seem important. That's kind of the consensus of contemporary educated understanding of magic, is that and people use this word, it's a bricolage of disconnected things that are just the residue of what our science can't explain. And I mean, I think that happens, and that's connected to it. But I think there is a core of things going on that are at the core of magic, which are not just sort of some random residuum of whatever a culture doesn't know how to deal with. But it has to do with this manifesting powers that are not ordinarily accessible to people by manipulating your nervous system through the practice of various rituals or drivers, and accessing knowledge. Accessing knowledge is one, and accessing powers is the other. Divination is accessing knowledge, and then various forms of malign and beneficent magic are the accessing of powers. And and it all, to me, it really it's really triggered by, or it depends on, this manipulation of consciousness as a way of manipulating the nervous system and getting the nervous system to be receptive to knowledge that it isn't normally receptive to, and to expressions of it, like a vision, that it normally wouldn't take the time or have the wherewithal to manifest to itself, or to manifest powers. I mean, a kind of trivial example, but it comes to mind, is I had a friend who was a mountain climber, and he went to South America, and he met up with some random guy at a base camp and was going up one of the Andes, and they were going up, and it was getting late in the afternoon, and they were going up this like 60-degree slope and climbing up it, and then they got to like 10 feet, 12 feet from the top, and it was just a sheer ice covered cliff. and a storm was coming in. They couldn't go back down. They couldn't stay where they were. And what was it? Lyndon Johnson had a saying, I feel like a hitchhiker in a Texas hailstorm. No, you can't run, you can't hide, and you can't make it stop. And so that's kind of the situation they were in. And so my friend said, he just was like, I'm going up. And so he started going up, and he said that his consciousness just focused in on these minute movements of his hand and these minute features, like almost like a you know, a microscope. And just he painstakingly climbed up this thing with a rope dangling, and he got to the top and he pulled himself over, and then he pulled the other guy up, and they were safe. And it's that, another example I'll give of a trivial thing is when I was a kid, I had a crush on a girl where I used to go on vacation, and her brother was making fun of me, and he was out in a boat about 50 or 60 yards away, and I was on the beach. He was in a little rowboat, and I was really angry, and I picked up a rock, and I wanted to just scare him. So I threw it, and I heard thump, thump. Ow. I never could have hit the guy. I was not a very good thrower. You know, I never could have hit the guy if I had intended to, or consciously if I had planned it or decided to do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it was that mobilization, that my anger and all the feelings in an adolescent, you know what I'm saying? And so to me, it's those sort of extraordinary powers that you get. And that's why I say magic doesn't depend on parapsychology. I mean, parapsychology is an interesting topic, and I've explored it and read Jung on it, among others. And I have my thoughts about it, but there's a whole range of things. There's this whole realm of things which are going on, which are separate from that, or don't involve that. Where that's magic too, and to me that's the bulk of magic. I mean, Mickey Mouse with lightning bolts coming out of his fingertips in front of a stormy background. Maybe that happens to some people, maybe there are people, but to me magic is a very subtle, and it's a very subtle and not all that power. It can be very powerful, but in most of the time, it's a very subtle and fleeting and ephemeral force. And that's why we're not ruled by mages with firebolts coming out of their fingertips, because we think of it as a kind of technology. And in some ways, ever since the Renaissance, at least, there has been this kind of interplay between visual arts and writing and magic that has kind of jacked up expectations about it.
Okay,
That
wait, hang
somehow
there, because
oh, sorry.
that's interesting. I mean, you've said so much. I've got all these notes ready to,
Okay.
like that. We do have a jacked up understanding. When I say shamanism or magic or witchcraft, there are particular images that come to people's mind, even the paranormal. And one of the things that Jeff Kripal has blessed me with is a way to maybe pull back a little bit from what is intimated by a word like the paranormal, and know that on some level it's weirder than the ways in which we've narrativized it. But it's not weird in the way we've narrativized it on some level. And so unpack this a little bit around what our kind of preconceived expectations of magic are, given our cultural lenses today.
Well, I mean, part of it is that magic depends on changing people's states of mind, on altering their consciousness. And one of the ways you can do that is by telling them stories and by jacking up their expectations. And so magicians have been complicit in this process because
Yeah.
at least in the short run, it enhanced their power. Because if people believed they had these powerful powers, then their powers that they did have were enhanced
Yeah.
because they were reinforced. I mean, the old trope about witchcraft is, yeah, people who believe in it are susceptible to it. Well, in my book, I am at pains to try to show that while that's true, it's not the whole story. And people who don't believe in magic, who are not aware of anything magical, are also susceptible to the processes that are at the root of witchcraft, or the belief in witchcraft, which is the interconnectedness between my psyche and yours, and the way that that can be manipulated either through unconscious forces or consciously to harm you. If and so so the belief in it is not the cause of the phenomenon. The belief in it is a result of the phenomenon, but it also is a reinforcer of the phenomenon.
Hmm.
And the same on the healing side. That if someone believes in the healing, it's not like again, we have this technological model of magic, like it's this thing you throw a switch and this happens. And anybody who's tried to meditate knows how hard it is to alter your state of consciousness in
Yeah.
a controlled or in a focused way. And and so we expect it to act like sort of one of our technologies, that you turn it on and you rev it up and you blast away with it. And it it depends on processes that are the manipulation of our own nervous system, the changing of our own minds.
So you're, I want to return to something you said earlier about this, what we call mirror neurons, and that's our name for it right now. What we're getting at is this, the illusion of our individual selves, that um, we are, our boundary is our skin. And that's such an illusion, and it's known in all kinds of intuitive religious traditions that are, from antiquity. But now, because of technology, and we're going to unpack this a lot, hopefully today, because of technology and democracy and monotheism and the incarnation of Christ in human form, we have these belief systems that are connected with how different an individual we are. But what you're saying is that there's an unseen nature to our lives and the way we function as an organism that is way more radically interconnected. So much so that I can, at a distance, have an effect on somebody's interiority and their physicality, which, if it doesn't baffle you, then you're not paying attention. And so let's talk about the limitations of our perceptions current day, regarding the modern understanding of the individual, and so on and so forth.
Well, I mean, I have a section toward the end of the realities book where I talk about that, but also that's the focus of the article on Descartes.
Yeah.
And that I mean, to boil it down, Descartes had bad dream experiences, unsuccessful dreams. The first one in that sequence related to malign people who were projecting bad magic at him, and it woke him up. And then he had this somnambulant experience where he saw the room was covered with sparks, and he was sore afraid and thought that it was, but then thought, is this really happening, or is it just my imagination? So he did these mental exercises and eye exercises where he closed and opened his eyes, and he determined to his own satisfaction that this was in fact really something going on in his brain, not something external. And then he was able to fall asleep and fell into a successful dream in Freudian terms. And I have to apologize. My father was a Freudian analyst, so
I
I
keep wanting to ask you
lean
about that. We're going to talk about that.
I lean Freudian. Um, but anyway, so he had this successful dream in which he had conversations with people, and it's more elaborate than that. But the basic idea was he then lapsed into a successful dream which was very intellectual and very sort of intellectualized. And so it's this idea that tuning the nervous system. Basically, he started out bothered by fears of magic and this dream, and he had an unsuccessful dream, and he woke up, and then he has a somnambulant experience, which is not that uncommon. But by manipulating his nervous system, by getting control of his nervous system and subjecting it to sort of rational series of steps to try, in my mind, what he was doing was he was retuning his nervous system away from being open to the kind of perception of the burning bush, or,
Mm.
this fiery stuff covering everything. And that that perception went away and was replaced with normal waking consciousness. And then that allowed him to sleep and have this sort of series of intellectualized dreams experiences. And so to me, and not just to me, to the guy I based the article on, the Freudian person who wrote the original article about the dream, without the neurocognitive stuff, but in Freudian terms. But, basically, the modern rationalist is trying to relate to reality in the way that a successful dreamer relates to their dream. That is, they observe it, they participate in it, but they are not viscerally attached to it. They're not bothered by it to the point that they wake up. Because if they wake up, that's an unsuccessful dream and they want to have a successful dream. And so this whole, and obviously when I was a kid, I went through my rationalist teenage phase. And part of all of this is my moving beyond that and, a kind of steadfast faith in rationality and, oh, why can't you just be rational and that kind of thing. And, having come to realize the limits of that kind of understanding in many different ways and through the connections I had with different people. But you know, uh, I think in general, the there are people who sort of cling to that
Mm.
belief in rationality. There's a phrase, I don't know who said it. Somebody said it, promissory positivism. You know, it's all rational. In the end, rationality will explain all of it. We can't really quite do it yet, but in the end, you got to believe. And that isn't that ironic?
Well, define that for a second. What is the difference between rational and irrational?
Between rationality and irrationality?
Irrationality. How would you differentiate those?
Well, actually, I think it's rationality has to do with the proportion between reason and observation. And there's
Mm.
nothing wrong with that, but um, it's come to be synonymous with a certain understanding of what logic yields and what experiences make up real experience, valid experiences. And so rationalists, um, because it was formed in opposition to sort of the scholastic reason, where you just follow the logic without regard to, you don't do experiments, you don't do empirical studies. In fact, um, in before science, in Western civilization and Western tradition, there was a strong bias against experience because experience is ephemeral. It's influenced by all kinds of extraneous things. It's one of a kind. It's can be totally misleading. You can't believe your eyes. So really, the only firm thing to hang on to is reason. But the Enlightenment rationalists realized that that led you into sort of witch, witch trials, among other things, that they didn't like. On the other hand, you've got to have a theoretical superstructure. You don't have just a series of experiences and observations. So rationality is trying to achieve a balance, which I got nothing against. It's just it becomes a kind of oh, what's the gaslighting?
That's a good term. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned this. That I was just talking to somebody earlier today about the modern medical. There is a community of folks in the medical world today that are trying to take the subjective experience out of psychedelics, thinking there's a kind of medicinal use that's the effective tool. But then you have all these folks that are like, no, it is the experience that's transformative because we are narrativizing narratives that are in the narrative and experiencing it. And then or we go cross-eyed because then we're thinking like, well, but we've got to externalize it and measure it and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I'm vaguely aware of that. I didn't know they were going to such extremes as to try to get rid of. But you're right. I mean, if they could extract chemicals out that would cause people to have psychedelic experiences without actually experiencing psychedelics, that would be the best thing for as far as they're concerned. And you're right. I agree with you. I think they're chasing a ghost, because if you get rid of the experience, you're getting rid of a substantial portion of what it is. I guess the idea would be you just take this modified limited LSD and suddenly you're at peace
I,
without all the
I'm just
messy.
I'm just better, you know. It's kind of, I mean, I'm at risk of speaking way far afield here, but it seems absurd to me that the experiences. Now, granted, I hear your warning, maybe if that may be strong, but that to accept one's experience as absolute truth is problematic.
Hmm.
But then to deny someone's experience as not verifiable truth is problematic. So
Yeah.
this dance between the rational and the irrational is really what I think you're after in so many ways.
Yeah. Well, there's another dimension to it, which is uh, that rationality, again, by convention, seeks sort of statistical meaning, statistical patterns, long-term knowledge effects, and magic or irrationality, but magic in particular, because I mean magic can be rational too. But anyway, we won't get into that. But in a way, it can. I don't know. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Anyway, what was I saying? That oh, just about the time frame. I mean, it's like statistically, the best thing to do if a cave bear is attacking you is to freeze. Let's say, I don't know that it is, but let's say that it is, that over time, the best thing to do is to freeze and let it get bored looking at this inert thing and go off and find something that runs away from it so that it can chase it and know that it's getting dinner. Yeah, I mean, that's not very accurate, but that idea. But in one instance, there's a tree over there. You think you can make it, so you make a break for it and you run and you climb up and you survive.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you pretend you're a statue and you flinch the slightest bit, the cave bear notices that you're really animate and eats you. You know what I mean? So it's like the singularity, the one-time effect, rather than worrying about what's true over time. It doesn't worry about what's true. It worries about what's effective, what
Mm-hmm.
gets the job done, what achieves the end state that you're looking for. And even if it's a 1 in a million chance, if you hit that 1 in a million, you're lucky. You're just good for you. And that's the magic. If you try to do it every day, you'll fail. But that's why it seems to come out in these pressured situations, like my throwing that rock or my friend being able to climb that 12-foot ice covered cliff. It takes an extreme emotional state
Yeah.
in order to focus you and galvanize, get your nervous system to configure itself in a way that's conducive to achieving that. And then you can. But
So let's say this because this is important. If our entire scientific paradigm is built around the idea of replication in a closed system, and then we have these dynamics that play themselves out in ways that are not subjected to a closed system, we can't measure it. And so what we tend to do is say, let's
well,
get rid of that.
hmm I mean, even worse than that is not being able to measure it is, I mean, let's take a step into the paranormal. If you think that there really are paranormal effects that people can, like psychokinesis,
Mm-hmm.
then every experiment ever done is potentially invalid because the experimenter, by sheer force of will, could have influenced the outcome of that experiment, and gotten the result that he or she was looking for. And that's what I think that's one reason why magic is so fundamentally incompatible with modern educated modernity. I
Yeah.
mean, I know from the book I did with Randall, or we edited with Randall, that of course there's a lot of magic in modernity, but this limited understanding of modernity going back into the Enlightenment tradition and the 19th century rationalists. Excuse me.
Bless you.
You know, that's just incompatible with the paranormal, because the paranormal subverts it. It says you can't have an isolated experiment. In fact, the only thing you can do is, if you do enough different experiments by different people, their psychic influences will cancel each other out,
Mm.
and you'll get the actual phenomenon by process of elimination. Um, but anyway, so.
Well, I want to introduce a word that, of course, is something that came up for me as we were talking, which is placebo. That when I was talking about how we just kind of toss it out, it goes under this heading of that's just a Jung wrote a lot about this. He said it's nothing but a placebo. And I want to say, well, that doesn't say a damn thing.
Well, it's dismissive of something
Yeah,
extremely powerful.
totally.
I mean, to say it's nothing but a placebo is to say this whole domain or this whole dimension of healing, that offends our sense of rationality. It offends our sense of individual agency. Offends our sense of, I mean, there are people who make the argument that it's unethical to use placebos for a practitioner to try to invoke the placebo effect, because it's
Hmm.
deceiving and that patients should have a clear-headed, rational understanding of what's happening to them. Uh,
it, it's so bad. I don't, I don't like, I understand we need to have ways in which we categorize and conceptualize and these various kind of roadmaps that we make. But to then say that because something doesn't make sense, that we have no way of understanding it, I, I,
well,
that's why I want to talk to people like you that like make a make a
well,
bunch of pages out of looking at this.
well, I had a very revelatory experience once in doing my research. I ended up looking through a medical textbook, general medicine textbook. And what I realized is it's all organ systems.
Yeah.
No wonder they don't want to talk about the pervasive, or they have difficulty talking about the pervasive psychological influence or the interplay between psychological, sociocultural influences
Hmm.
and bodily health, because the way they organize their knowledge is as a whole series of discrete organ systems,
Hmm.
which, I mean, it makes sense and it's been very powerful, and I'm not knocking it, but it did make me understand why it's taken a long time and it's proven, difficult to integrate the kind of traditional Western allopathic medicine and these other traditions, because, the psychological one, the spiritual one, requires a fundamentally different approach to the issue of health, and it doesn't fit easily into, you know although, they could do there's more people can do, and I'm sure are doing, like, there are hormonal dimensions to psychological states
Hmm.
which would have an influence on the digestive system, and they know these things. I mean, it's not that this is all hidden. It's just, how do you organize it, and how do you integrate knowledge that comes out of one kind of fundamental form of organization with knowledge that comes out of and embodied in a radically different form of organization. So,
I talked with Tanya Lerman once, and she wrote a wonderful book called When God Talks Back, and also did I think her dissertation on a coven of witches that she was connected with in England. She was
hmm
at Oxford, and
yeah.
I, what was so great about one of the things she said, I lived with these witches, and really weird things would happen, and it was. I couldn't make sense of it. And then I also lived with these evangelical Christians who would like talk to God and pour God a cup of coffee in the morning, and really weird things happen. And it was like I couldn't explain it. And so
Uh-huh.
you start to see in it's transcultural.
hmm
It's both related to the culture and built into the culture, and also transcultural, meaning it'll show up everywhere. So Um, Maybe we can talk about that culture a little bit, and then I also want to get into the. I mean, this book you put out, the Magic in the Modern World, goes through the from Enlightenment to today. I'd love to do an overview of the kind of how magic has flowed from your article on Descartes on. I know that's a lot of questions, but that's just how I operate.
Okay. Well, where do you want to start? The first thing you were talking about Luhrmann and oh, and well, I was going to say Levi Strauss talked about a shaman that he had worked with who admitted that much of what he did was fraudulent,
Uh-huh.
was just sleight of hand. But he was convinced, one, that he had helped people, and two, that there were certain points at which inexplicable things did happen,
Yeah.
and things that were surprised him were not part of the trick, but were extensions of it. And so, again, going back to the whole paranormal issue, I mean, to the extent that paranormal powers and forces may be involved, may be real, and may be involved with magic, they're kind of the outer extension of it. They're they're an outer edge, not the core of it. The
Hmm.
core of it is this relationship between our psyches, our nervous systems, and knowledge and powers that we can tap by manipulating them. Anyway, then the second, what was the second part of the you went on to?
Yeah, I was talking about
Oh,
the to do an overview of the kind of modernity and starting at
well,
Descartes, on.
I mean, basically the point of the article I wrote on Descartes was that, he basically realized that by getting control of his nervous system and tuning it in a certain way, he didn't think of it in this way, but by tuning his nervous system in a certain way, he was able to avoid the uncomfortable experiences that he was having, psychological experiences he was having, and cultivate um, uh, uh, pleasurable and useful ones. And he pointed to that night and those three dreams as the seminal turning point in his life and the foundation of everything that came after. I mean, so this is not just randomly picking some set of experiences and saying, "Oh, isn't that interesting?" But he pointed to these. And there's a lot of, there's a big literature about them, of course. But
Hmm.
anyway, so I mean, to a considerable extent, one of the things I talk about in the realities of witchcraft toward the end is, this became a social cultural program. It wasn't just individual, but by individuals training their kids, we train ourselves not to think in this way. And we train ourselves to reject to not experiencing things this way, to not credit what we experience as having any importance, and to not credit the outcomes of it, to the reported outcomes of it or the results of it. And so it's suppressed both as a body of knowledge and as a way of acquiring knowledge or of obtaining valid knowledge and exercising real power in the world. And so by the late 18th century, one of the interesting things in the last chapter about the suppression of magic, I mean, I see the witch trials in an important way as part of a much larger campaign that had started really in antiquity with the Greek, I mean, people trace it back. Magic comes from magus, the Persian priests who were seen as a foreign influence and a way of sort of demonizing indigenous practitioners of non-official cults, was to call them magi, associate them with the evil enemy, the evil empire off to the east.
Hmm.
And that was the beginnings. And there are kind of two tools that are used in the repression of magic. One is physical repression, punishment, up to and including burning people at the stake, or whatever, taking away, burning their books, or putting them in jail, or exiling them, or but the other one is to deny the potency of it, and usually, it starts with repression, and then once the repression has succeeded substantially, it switches over to denial, and then that, gets takes the campaign even further. And the Christian, the Roman Empire tried to suppress magic at one point. And the rational tradition, going back to Greek philosophy, always had a skeptical tradition, which denied the reality of these things and just said it's all in your head. And in the Middle Ages, um, the church basically used denial because it was very weak. In that case, it didn't have the ability to suppress magic. I mean, this is kind of a broad brushstroke reading I have out of it. That in the High Middle Ages, I mean, in the early and High Middle Ages, the government, secular and religious together, didn't have the power to suppress magic. I mean, they did outlaw it. They didn't allow, whole pagan cults to exist, but individualized magical practitioners were scattered throughout the countryside and practiced, and they emphasized the illusory nature of it. And this famous canon episcopi, the medieval church had what was called the episcopi tradition. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but anyway, um, that basically said that women who believe they ride at night with Diana are subject to delusions, that this is delusional and it's a diabolic delusion, that people are hoodwinked by the devil into thinking they're getting powers that they don't have. And then in the early modern period, it just so happens that the witch trials happened at the time when the secular governments were gaining enough power over the countryside that they could actually conceive of actually suppressing these sorts of things.
Can I jump in here real quick, because there's something of interest here, because we're back to that earlier thread we were talking about alternate states of consciousness and the psychedelics and the subjective experience of that. And there are some who would assert that riding on the wings of the devil, or whatever the practice is, that witches, quote witches, were using dildos as applicators to bring some kind of substance which could create a psychedelic experience, essentially. And that what was then demonized, as we were just saying, is kind of in modern times today too, are these folks that are connected with alternate states of consciousness and creating these rituals and practices that involve alternate states. Where does that take us?
Yeah, well, I mean, that Michael Harner was the one who was talking about women using broomsticks as dildos, and
Mm-hmm.
I never ran across anything that suggested that, but there definitely, I have a whole chapter in my book where I talk about uh, experiences, diabolic experiences, and I talk about the use of hallucinogens.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, my conclusion is there definitely were ointments out there. I mean, they have recipes of them, and people made those recipes, and there were cases where people applied them and were observed applying them. There were cases where people applied them and reported what they saw and experienced. And I mean, I found in the archive in Württemberg a couple of cases that seemed like, to me, the best explanation was in one case that a young man had gotten a pot with some stuff in it and had used it one night when he was kind of at his wits' ends about what to do, and ended up putting himself in jail. I don't know if you read that chapter,
I
but
did.
yeah, okay. And then, but then there was also this group of teenagers who went off to the strawberry patch and ate what sounds like bread that had ergot
Mm-hmm.
in it. And I mean, um, the thing to keep in mind is that we tend to think of it like drug or not drug, or did they have psychedelics or didn't they have psychedelics? And the fact is that there was a whole range of understanding of plants and things that could have influence on people's bodies and minds. And for example, ergot was used routinely in childbirth because it constricts the blood vessels. And so midwives would use it to suppress bleeding when if a woman was bleeding, and people knew, and the solanaceous herbs as well. They were used in medicine. And so it's not like, oh, did people know about these or not, or were these things used or not? It's like, yes, people knew about these things and they used them. And the controversy is people who say, oh, but they never used them to get high. They just used the part that
Yeah, all of humanity would never suggest that they used them to get high. Sure.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's I I understand where it's coming from, and I don't know. I don't agree with it. I mean, I think the evidence is overwhelming, and I think the evidence in the cases that I cite was very strong. I mean, these girls, they described special, peculiar pieces of grains, you know, peculiar grains that they ate. And they went out and they ate them. And then one of them was found dancing wildly in a field, later by a couple of women. I mean, it's like, I don't know. Do we dig her up and see if we can find traces of the chemicals in her bones? I mean, at what point do you the in fact, Württemberg, I don't make that much of it, but Württemberg actually had an ordinance in the 17th century that it passed against the cultivation, the cultivation or the propagation and consumption of henbane.
Uh-huh.
They actually had a law against cultivating and consuming henbane. And it came out of a case that was adjudicated. I couldn't find the original case, a neighboring small territory that was autonomous brought to them a case where a girl had subject been found to have taken henbane and had had deleterious effects from it, or
Hmm.
taken to the doctor like someone with a bad trip. And unfortunately, I was never able to get to the root of it. Like, was this something she did on purpose? It's always possible that she just ate it by accident. I mean,
Right.
without knowing, I can't really say whether it was deliberate or not. But the wording of it sounds, against the propagation and consumption of henbane. I mean, you don't make illegal something that people consume by accident.
Right.
You make a law against it usually when you think people are doing it on purpose.
Hmm.
And so that's another piece of evidence. But again, this young man and the description of his stories, and I used Arrowwood's experience vault. I don't know if you are familiar with that online. It's just people who've had various drug experiences with
Mm.
all sorts of different things write about experiences. And I found modern people with no connection to any of the sources that I have describing analogous things to the descriptions of what this guy said his experience was. And so uh, I think, to me, there's no question people were aware of these. Well, we know people were aware of them because the recipes existed, but people were making those recipes, and we know people were racing them because we have good evidence of people having made them. And we know that people were taking them, and there are documented cases where that's reported, and differing circumstances, several different cases are reported. And there's this clinging. There is a what I see as the sort of last ditch denial attempt is to say, well, this was just descriptions, this was just words, people told stories, this was just, they were repeating things. People try to trace it all back to Apollonius and the golden ass, I think it is, where this guy, you know, observes a woman anoint herself and turn into a bird and fly off. And somehow that's the source of a story where someone saw an ugly old woman anoint herself with this and fall into a stupor and then come back and claim that she had flown. Well, in Apuleius, she actually physically transformed in the story. And in the early modern one, she just fell asleep and they kicked her and they couldn't wake her up, and she was gone out for, 18 hours or something, and, for a long, long time. And then when she came back, she told them about how she'd flown across the countryside and
Hmm.
met with people and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I don't know. I feel to me, the evidence is overwhelming. And there was a network of people. You know, there were people who knew people, and that's how the recipes got passed around in different traditions. I mean, in southwestern Germany, ergot seemed like you know, I had several cases that I came across. The one I talked about with the two teenagers going off in the strawberry patch was the most, you know, the clearest and the most substantial. But there was another case where a girl, an old woman gave a girl a piece of bread, and then she basically described was seen dancing around and, you know, had this weird encounter with this red-haired man, and she described these very fantastic experiences that she had. And, you know, I mean, do I know that the old woman gave her the bread intending this to happen? No, I don't. You know, how can I? I mean, the woman didn't confess to it. And if she did confess, we'd say she was tortured into it. And if she wasn't tortured, then she was intimidated into it. And if she wasn't intimidated into it, then she was delusional and self-aggrandizing, you know, sort of blowing herself. You know, I mean, you can all. That's an interesting. Actually, it gets into this one of the chapters of the book on magic in the modern world I really like, is the one about why magic can't be falsified.
Yeah, that
And
was
what the
great.
author says is it's not just magic that can't be falsified, science can't be falsified either. It's like it's not like an experiment is performed and suddenly everybody says, oh, you know, now we see the light. You know, it's like, you know, different experiments are formed, the consensus changes, the theory is adapted to accommodate it. There are some holdouts, you know, who never agree to it. You know, there were people who went to their graves long after Einstein who totally rejected. In fact, can I tell you a joke? I don't
Please.
know. How does science advance?
Oh, yeah, I think I know this one, but I want you to say the punchline.
One funeral at a
That's
time.
right. Yes. Yeah, I read a massive study on this that science, the hierarchical model of these folks with tenure and so on and so forth, that they've got to die off for the innovation to happen. That's wild.
Yeah, well, the more benign one is one retirement at a time,
Right.
but
Let's go with the death, you know. May as well go for the
but
gold.
besides, retired people still have considerable influence, especially in academe.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
but
Well, and this
yeah,
is a really, just to punctuate this for a second. Walter Hanegraaff and Jeffrey Kripal have written a lot about the what's left out of the academy. How many folks have these? And I've been blown away in religious studies. How many folks that are professors of religious studies that have really wild experiences, but would never be a practitioner of that experience, you know, or loyal to that
mhm,
religious paradigm. Instead, you know, we say, no, we can't do that. You can't be a practitioner. You've got to be an objective
mhm,
statistician.
mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a useful structure to create and to use. I mean, the
Yeah.
Western civilization, the world has gained a lot from it. I don't slight it, but it's not the be all and end all,
Yeah.
you know, and that's a problem that I have when, you know, there are people who totalize things. When I was first in graduate school, there was kind of a Marxism that was totalizing, that this
Hmm.
was the explanation of everything. Everything could be boiled down to Marxism. And now, I don't know what it's like exactly now, but you know, in the last generation, it was sort of semiotics.
Hmm.
Everything is just a constellation of symbols that people create, and you know, that's what reality is the constellation of symbols that human beings create for themselves. And you know, every culture has its own constellation, and so every culture has its own reality, and there's no, in a way, it's like the Copenhagen consensus on quantum mechanics. It's like if we can't know it, it doesn't exist. Reality is what we know, and you know, I guess I'm uncomfortable with that. I'm both in postmodernism and in quantum mechanics because to me, I mean, Freud had the reality principle. You know, that at the very least, if everything is just my dream, there are kind of two different qualities to parts of my dream experience. Some qualities, some parts of my dream experience are things which are extremely malleable and connected to myself and the own internal dynamics of what I'm feeling and experiencing and thinking. And then there's another part of it that I can't prove isn't all I have is my perceptions of it and my experience of it, but somehow it seems to march to a different drummer. It does things that seem more distant from my control and my influence and my knowledge and understanding, and yet it does those things. And so I'll call that reality. And the other objective reality, and the other is my subjective experience. And I guess I feel like, I mean, all knowledge is voyeuristic.
Yeah.
It's just an approximation of this infinitely complex, infinitely extending reality that envelops us, and with very limited, I mean, incredibly powerful and complex, but still, in comparison to that limited, neurological equipment, we do our best to model it and to understand it and to interact with it in ways that, allow us to propagate and, have future generations come along. But, that's I guess one of the things I think about is, you know, the rationalists and the non-rationalists sort of square off as if one of them can win and there's a definitive. And my feeling is they're both a very limited, partial explanations for something which is way beyond both of them.
Yeah.
And the
Well said.
and and so I mean, and in fact, to go a little further with the line of thinking I've been thinking about these, that basically the sort of rationalist tradition I think of as mechanomorphic. If the other one is anthropomorphic, it's
Yeah.
mechanomorphic.
I love that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's like, yes, there is much in the external world and much in reality that operates in mechanical principles and is a very powerful way of understanding things, but it's not the only way of understanding things. And in another way, I think of religion and to some extent magic, but certainly religion is kind of applying, well, much of this is applying theory of mind to what scientists or rationalists would consider the objective universe. It's just assume that that this physical space we're in and the objects in it are actually all animate, and use the same set of cognitive tools that we use to deal with other people, to understand that realm. And of course, with some things, that's a very rational thing to do, like with cave bears. If you see the cave bear looking in a particular way, you can kind of infer some of the things about what it's thinking and what it might do, and it's more probable it'll do one thing than another. So, there's in reality, it's not an all or nothing thing. It's like, yeah, there are ways in which the non-human world acts in a way that theory of mind is useful to think of. And, I mean, beyond that, I don't know. I mean, it's like I said, it's not like one or the other is the right heuristic to use. It's that each one has its utility, each one has its limitations, and neither of them is likely to be completely satisfactory. Both of them have something to say. So anyway.
Well, there's on this alternate states of consciousness thread, there does seem like what can you say about the? I mean, I might be a bit dramatic here, but the war on these alternate states. I mean, I can use that term only because, my God, if you've got a bunch of midwives dancing under the moonlight, tripping, laughing and dancing, and then we say that's a horrible thing and we need to burn them. What the hell is going on there?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a crystallization process where society was evolving into more complex, more highly structured form, and there was a logic and a need for people to behave in certain ways within it, to optimize their functioning within it. And the other way of doing things um, kind of got in the way. It's like, what happened to the Holy Spirit?
Mm.
It took me a long time to understand what the Holy Spirit is. The Holy Spirit is the experience people have of oneness with God.
Mhm.
And early on, they decided, don't do too much of that because then everybody's a prophet.
Mm.
And everybody who has where do you draw the line? And so it became, religion, Christian religion certainly became very formulaic and based on rituals and dogmas because those were controllable. And the Holy Spirit, people do all kinds of wild things with the Holy Spirit. And, I mean, I think in that chapter where I talk about the hallucinogens, I say, it's like you go out sailing on the Devil's Sea and you never know where you'll end up. You embark on this journey and, you can end up in the lap of God or you can end up surrounded by dead bodies. Um, hopefully not.
Right.
But part of it is that, and and I have to say, I think Christianity won because living in a world of magic is hard. It's a hard, cold world where power is the ultimate arbiter, and you know cruelty and they're real things and they're acknowledged and they are kind of sometimes accepted and channeled. And I don't mean to impute a pagan tradition, but it's just magic depends on your ability to keep your head above water in this constant struggle for spiritual power and survival and potency and the Christian religion is very reassuring. I mean, it's sort of there's a big daddy up there who has the best in mind and he's done things to help us out. And, if you just believe, you will be, you got a good chance of getting through unscathed. And if you're scathed, at least you'll have these psychological defenses that, you're doing the right thing, you're dying for a good cause, you're going to go to a better place, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a much nicer world to live in than one in which there are shadowy forces at the edge of every firelight and, lurking out there waiting to suck up your life force and energy and use it for its own purposes. Um, I don't know. I don't, and again, I don't want to get myself in trouble with pagans because I'm not trying to demonize them, but it is a harsher and more exacting world when you're immersed in magic than in a benevolent religious belief system.
It's interesting because that's essentially invoking the kind of social dynamic, that there's, as population increases, we have this evolutionary need to behave and to not kill each other and steal from each other and have one voice, not six. Like let's agree that there's one culture and society, and let's bind together and connect. And so there's a social dynamic here that's important. And
Hmm.
that's I certainly get that in a lot of ways. There also is a part of me that's really curious about this thing you said about a prophet. That when you have a lot of prophets running around because they've been struck by a mystical experience, that's got to be a pretty wild, destabilizing space. There is a part of me that also has maybe I'm in this cultural lens, and so there's probably some romanticizing that I'm doing around magic and around kind of um, the freedom to encounter an alternate state of experience and try to make sense of that, and then also be a healthy social being in the world. This kind of both and that. So push on that a little bit. That um, what is so uncomfortable around kind of this dark versus light magic as it plays out in a culture that doesn't have those kind of foundational uh, the glue that binds us together.
Um, hmm, um, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably wasn't very clear. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we've got a bit of a dual dynamic set up here, and that there's a kind of social function that Christianity provided for the culture to bring us together, and that there were real problems around um, prophets and magi and all these various folks um, that are more self-oriented. It's probably a lot more narcissistic than it is. I could actually get behind the fact that a world of magic may predispose somebody to disconnect from the social spaces. You know, because you can't exactly be a witch and live in the city center in the marketplace. So it kind of you're
Some do.
wanting it's well, and you would know, you know. So I guess what I'm getting at is this. Is
Well,
this
I think I know what you're saying. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of magic is actually social in the sense that small groups do it. Small scale societies do it, and small groups within larger societies do it. So it's not completely asocial, but it just puts a premium on individual experience and that immediate. Yeah, it's funny. I have a debate with a friend of mine, or would you rather be right for the wrong reasons or wrong for the right reasons? And our culture is it's better to be wrong for the right reasons because
yeah.
in the long run, the right reasons are going to prevail, and you're going to end up being right. Is in the long run, promissory positivism. But magic goes the other way. It's better to be right for the wrong reasons. You may have a completely, idiosyncratic and ungrounded idea of what's going on, but if you end up accomplishing what it is that you set out to accomplish, it was successful. It worked. And so yeah, I think in that way, basically, modern society needs us to be widgets and
Yeah,
and
that's
and widgets that have a shape and fit with the other widgets and connect in reliable and predictable ways um and magic and shamanism tend to pull in the opposite direction. They tend to get people to have these individualistic experiences and to start listening to their own drummer. And
so what sense do you make of what's happening in the psychedelic territory right now with this kind of explosion of these substances?
you mean the use of them in therapies and stuff?
Oh
Oh, wait a
yeah,
minute. I gotta. Yeah, no, I've read a little bit about that, microdoses and all that sort
sure.
of stuff. Um, doesn't sound like all that much fun. Um,
Well, there's plenty of folks that are doing these macro experiences. I mean, ayahuasca is all over I'm reading about it
yeah,
everywhere.
yeah. Well, um, yeah. I mean, well, one of the things that's going on in industrial society is that we went through the age of mass production where there's one kind of deodorant, which is now there are 20 different kinds of deodorant. If you go to so our society has evolved to the point where individualized experiences somehow are boutique experiences are somehow accommodated more,
Hmm.
partly because computers make us able to fine tune things much better. Inventory, you can have an inventory of 12 different kinds of deodorant. The lemon scented one and the garlic one and the neutral one and the whatever. Because, you don't need to just have that one that gets cranked out of the factory. So,
Right.
so society is evolving in that way. Um, that's certainly part of it. And societies, they're becoming more part of our culture too. I mean, our culture now has, 50 years of experience of these on a mass scale.
Mm.
To some extent. In 1950, that wasn't true. They were very foreign and distant and not understood, even, either in a scientific way or even on the level of popular culture. But now, we have three generations of deadheads to draw upon. Uh,
Nice. It's odd, yeah, because it is what I'm hearing so much about are the question really is born out of this comment you make about the prophet, how there are folks all over the place going out, whether it's to an ayahuasca ceremony or psilocybin or MDMA, and they have these radical mystical experiences, and then are changing their lives and have been touched by what they would say. I mean, this is the language that a lot of people use, is this divine experience, or something
mhm,
totally mysterious, totally undigestible by waking consciousness, by
mhm.
typical normative waking consciousness. And to have that experience can transform one's life. And what I notice is happening in a lot of spaces is people are there's a there's a lot of prophets. They're
Yep.
speaking for that experience. And so it just clicks when you said that. It's like, wow, there are tons of folks who, I mean, they'll go out and have one experience in a psilocybin context and then decide that they're a guide and they're ready to guide other people in those experiences. And I think I've got tons of issues with that, given that holding space for people is is something that deserves a lot of training. So
Mhm.
that's one of the things that kind of stands out about this idea of the prophet, that we're all capable of it, I think. Um, but to become the prophet is another issue altogether.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, for yourself is fine, although not always. I think of Charles Manson, but
Right. Right.
but um, but yeah, leading other people is a different kettle of fish, and I don't know.
Well, on that note, how much time do we have? How long do you got?
It's 5:20. We have another 40 minutes till
Are you
six
good? Okay,
o'clock.
you can go to 6.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
I
good.
I, I can go all night.
We may have, I've got a patient in a bit, but that's perfect
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
Well,
No, that's
maybe 25 more minutes, and then we'll start to wrap it up.
okay.
Um, so talking about the institution, I'm reminded of what I forget who was writing about it in Magic in the Modern World. This the underground, and if you just pay attention to what's happening in our current political conversation, there are blood drinking pedophiles that eat babies and reptiles, and all these very deeply they're not new, right? These projections have been even way back into Greek and in antiquity. um, what's happening is this eruption of the Illuminati, all these kind of organized structures that are beneath the culture, that are in charge in some way and using some kind of ritualistic magic or ceremonial magic. So of course, the Golden Dawn is one of the crews I was thinking of, and you tracked that, and somebody did in the book, and I wanted to just see if you can
Hmm.
comment on. We talked about the Enlightenment and how magic has kind of flowed through the underworld of the esoteric and occult, and how it's emerging today.
Well, I mean, in the 19th century, you know, it became intellectualized in a lot of ways. I mean, it became part of a literate tradition. I mean, there were a lot of changes, and I'm trying to put them in order. The place I'm going to start is with tarot cards, which I talk about in my book, because at the very end of the time period I studied, like around 1800, suddenly there was a case against some women who had been reading cards, and
Mm-hmm.
never before had cards been read. No mention of cards. And I went back and I looked at the history of tarot cards, and originally they were kind of a parlor game, and they had a kind of like Ouija boards or whatever, a fun
Mm-hmm.
party element with a sort of divinatory gloss to them. And they actually referred into a chart. They didn't have the meaning on the card. They referred you to a chart. And um, I think I'm trying to remember. Maybe I'm mixing that with something. Anyway, but the point is that, and I make the analogy. I say that, before that, people use the sieve and shears. You take a sieve, like a kitchen sieve, and but one that can balance, and you balance it on a pair of garden shear type things, like big scissors
Mhm.
on the point, and then you ask it a question like, "Who stole the bag of money out of my barn?" And they start saying names, and when Farmer Smith 2 farms over is mentioned, it begins to circle, and it's this isomorphic effect that people have of unconscious, like that controls the Ouija board. um and that was divination. And then I said, so the tarot cards with this rich symbolism, these pictures and this incredible symbolism, 10 different lower cards in 4 different suits, and then the face cards, and then the major arcana, you've got all these specialized meanings. And I said, they were to the sieve and shears what the railroad train was to the horse and buggy.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
was like a whole new level of magical technology in a way. And just an incredibly rich field of things to draw from and they attempted to root them back in ancient Egypt and stuff like that's one of the strategies of legitimation that Aspram talks about. He's the one who traced D, and so there was this
Mhm.
this attempt to create, to draw on older traditions, and create what were felt to be authentic experiences, ancient experiences, um, that were rooted, they were modern conglomerations, they were modern interpretations, modern ways of doing it, but they, by and large, consciously or self-consciously attempted to root themselves in traditional forms of magic and knowledge, and to some extent, they grew out of it. I mean, I talk with students sometimes who say, oh, my grandmother came from Sicily, and she was a seer, and a woman who was kind of a new ager in a course I taught on women and witchcraft, and she was kind of new age, but her grandmother was really right out of the old Sicilian peasant tradition
Mhm.
of popular magic. And so there definitely was a continuity, but there's kind of this mixing of elements, which was very rich and fertile. Then in the 20th century, with the Necronomicon, which Dan Harms talks about, that was just made up completely. That was taken out of a Lovecraft. The word Necronomicon comes out of a Lovecraft book from the 1920s. And then in the 1950s, somebody created this whole, he took that name of this book and he built a book out of it, and he tied it to all these fictional or new kind of ancient spiritual traditions that he made up or that he loosely linked to something. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So in the 20th century, there was, a more eclectic and somewhat cutting cutting themselves loose from this need to be rooted in ancient traditions. Although usually they kept some, there's always an ambivalence or always an aspect of it because they do grow out of ancient traditions, and even the Necronomicon. Presumably Lovecraft was steeped in, all kinds of knowledge of traditions coming before him out of the 19th century, and they were again a mixture of actual old traditions and new implementations, new interpretations, new understandings of them. Um, and then there's,
Mm.
so that's one dynamic that these guys talk about in the second half of our book. The other is, using science, and in some ways, I'm kind of uh, connected with that, and some people try to tar me with that brush, but of trying to find scientific explanations, root magic in scientific understanding, connect it to science, and I'm not trying to legitimize. Well, I guess I am trying to legitimize magical understanding by saying, because I think it's true. Magic draws out unconscious knowledge. It manifests things that we know inside of ourselves, and our nervous systems are aware of this, but we don't know how to communicate it to ourselves. So, we have a vision, and that vision informs our conscious knowledge, or we hear voices or something. Um, but anyway, but there are magical traditions that, that's a part of magical traditions that are more, I mean, I'm doing it to try to understand this as a science, sort of scientifically, as a scholar, as a historian, to make sense of it in the sort of rationalist tradition. Other people working in the magical tradition try to draw on science to sort of legitimize, oh, you should believe this because there's the placebo effect. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
using the placebo effect, and the placebo effect has been scientifically validated. So therefore, if I can evoke the placebo effect, I'm doing something that even science would recognize as valid. And that may help some people, suspend disbelief or engage belief and get the benefits of the placebo effect. I don't know. But anyway, the point is that's another thing that was going on in the 19th to 20th century, more in the 20th century. I mean, it started in the 19th century. There definitely were attempts to connect science and magic in the 19th century,
And
but it
it
became
seems
more common in the 20th. Yeah.
it seems science fiction too. That was a
Yeah. Yeah, science fiction overlaps with fantasy to some extent. I mean, they're distinct genres. Um, Science fiction sometimes will have magical type things in it, but less likely, more
well.
likely.
I guess there's just there's a fundamental question here that is a philosophical question about, and maybe even metaphysical, about what is true and how do we define what
Hmm.
true is. And um, what do they say? One plus one is three. There's this idea of a Zen koan that I heard a long time ago, that if it's not paradox, it's not true. We have to be in this kind of two and one, yin and yang dynamic, two seemingly opposing dynamics that are in unified existence together, forming one, and so they're both one and two. Like that seems to be a theme. That there is a I stumbled upon your work through Michael Winkelmann, and
Hmm.
he was just citing from you all over the place, and I thought, oh my god, I got to talk to this guy. And
Oh, that's good.
and and one of the things that he in his study on shamanism looks at is ritual. As we're talking about placebo, but ritual. Which can't always work. Just because I bow down and touch my head to the floor doesn't mean I'm going to be freed of all my sins. But in the right context, right circumstances, right experience, maybe doing that has me feeling some degree of awe and reverence that cleanses me of some guilt or some issue. And then
Hmm.
we say, "Oh my God, it worked," but it works, and it also doesn't work, and that's part of the practice. And so it seems like in the 20s, 30s, you have this underground movement of all these folks that are coming together to do this ceremonial magic in ritualistic form, trying to understand what this is, but also doing some wacky stuff in the process.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, in the mid 20th century, there was the Parsons, the guy from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. That was, I found a fascinating
That was
article
cool.
that, yeah,
That was Eric
just,
Davis, right? I think that
yeah,
was, yeah,
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 yeah. No, I thought that was very good. And, this guy who was at the forefront of the space age and jet propulsion was also deeply immersed in the occult. And,
yeah.
uh, well, I mean, again, it goes back to, when you were talking, I was thinking it goes back to this complementarity of, the rational and the mystical, the mechanomorphism and the anthropomorphism, and they do complement each other. And since each one yields insights and understanding and enables you in different ways than the other, if you can tap into both of them in some kind of
Right.
modulation or you know um, drawing on the appropriate one at the right time, um, that kind of optimizes your operational strategy. Um, in dealing with the world. And again, that even both of them together, they're both just voyeuristic approximations. They're voyeuristic ways of organizing under knowledge and understanding and mobilizing action. And certainly in terms of encompassing knowledge, even the both of them together, I think undoubtedly leave out most, almost everything. I
So,
wouldn't go that far.
well, what do you say about current? Like, where do you see this magic playing out current day? What?
Um, it's interesting because, for example, poltergeists. I mean, my reading of poltergeists is that they are a psychokinetic
Yeah.
phenomenon, and they were linked to disaffected teens, young people who are frustrated. I actually have a case. I think I talk about it in my book. I talk about a poltergeist case where there was this woman, a very active, energetic leader type woman who had a very debilitating pregnancy, and she was bedridden, and she was past due. And then there were some people, the pots and pans started, things started flying around on inexplicable noises and stuff. And so one of the town leaders, I don't remember, the mayor or one of the top officials, and his son went to stay with her. And while they were there, this big urn, kind of flew off a shelf and smashed itself in the middle of the kitchen, and nobody could explain how it could have been thrown that far or anything. And again, can't prove anything with 100 year, 200, 300-year old cases, but I'm going to go with it and say that,
Hmm.
but now with all these psychotropic medicines that they give to people who are depressed or anxious or what have you, I won't be surprised if that kind of phenomenon, becomes less common
Hmm.
and less frequent. Um, and the extent to which, people disbelieve in magic, they will try it less, they will respond to it less, they will whistle louder as they walk past the graveyard. And
It's a good image.
and and so that will diminish it. On the other hand, I don't know. I think the rise of of moving sound, image, entertainment, and dissemination of knowledge as opposed to written things may actually foster it because,
Hmm.
so there are countervailing tendencies going on, and I don't think it's going to go away because I think it's a part of human dynamics, the basic structure of human experience and human nervous functioning. Um, I don't think that it's going to take over the world because it doesn't fit very well with the bureaucratic consumer, economic uh, society that we live in. But it's going to continue to inform people's individual experience and understanding of the world. Um, so anyway, that's you asked me what I think about the present, and that's about it. I mean, it seems like it's enjoying more legitimacy, sense of
Hmm.
legitimacy than it has for a long, long time. And there are many groups which embrace it, openly and positively, which is different. Even in the 50s, it was kind of secret. People
Right.
skulked around and, didn't talk about it openly, and it was a secret kind of sketchy, marginal thing. Um,
Well, this
but that's changing.
this to quote Eric Davis, actually, since you were just talking about him, he says Durkheim's conception of the social function of religion instead looks at magical practices and behaviors as an expressive cultural communication whose meaning and effect should be judged in terms of symbolic or dramatic significance rather than in the causal terms of proto-scientific efficacy and instrumental control.
That's what I call Durkheim's diktat. Durkheim just said social phenomena have social causes. And I'm sympathetic to why he wanted to assert that when he did. And I think that sealing off social phenomena from psychologizing served a good function, but I also think in the end it's wrong, um, because psychological dynamics do affect social phenomena. Physical reality affects social phenomena, cause and effect. And also, I don't agree. I mean, you got to remember that 150 years of rational scientific tradition started from the premise that you have to explain why people believe something that isn't true. But I start from trying to explain what's true about what people believe and understand what's true about it. And I think it includes causal mechanisms, both on the psychological, the link between people's psyches and physiologies as mediated by their expression in various forms and actions, and then there's also, again, we've danced on the edges of parapsychology, but to the extent that that's validated, there's also this direct physiological effect that we project. We may project power out of ourselves and onto other people and processes, independent of any symbolism. Um,
Hmm.
Actually, it occurred to me that Chat GPT may be the beginning of because the beginning of the a new level of victory for semiotics, because
Mhm.
Chat GPT is nothing but a symbol processor. It has no idea of what's real or unreal. It has no visceral experience. It has no corpus of physical knowledge directly from itself. It just predicts what word will fit after the last word, most probably.
I love that you brought
And
this up. Yeah. Yeah.
and so it's really going to be it is a semiotic mechanism, a semiotic machine. And to the extent that it takes over writing and thinking for us, we really will become semioticized.
Well, this is an argument for the biopsychosocial symbolic or spiritual model that we need to. And I stumbled into this when I was doing my dissertation when I realized that there are a lot of people that study religions that know there are different levels by which you can interpret any tradition. And what I looked at in particular was the historic, the psychological, the sociological, and the symbolic levels of interpretation. And most of the time that we have fights, it's when people are arguing on different levels. Somebody is taking, a religious tradition as an historical truth, and somebody else is saying, wait a second, this serves a sociological function, and so on and so forth. And I think that to take the whole as well, not again back to if it's not paradox, it's not true. To let yourself have a little fluidity and not become so fixed.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Um, I, I think you left out physiological.
Biological. I said, yeah,
Oh, you did
yeah,
say biological. Okay, okay.
biopsychosocial. Yeah,
Okay, yeah,
but
yeah.
that's a good. Yeah,
So
it's
you
an
did.
important note.
So, yeah. No, but you didn't leave it out, so I take that back.
Well, I
But
want to. If you have anything on this,
no, just that I was gonna emphasize that I think it is rooted in physiological experiences people have,
yeah.
and they're not they. It's like eating and hunger. I mean, everybody experiences hunger, everybody eats, but culture informs many things about what we eat and when we eat and the way we eat and what makes us hungry and, all kinds of things. So culture is very important. I think I was saying that, when I was a grad student and an undergraduate, Marxism was kind of
Mm-hmm.
this hegemonic explanatory system. And then by the 90s, semiotics had become a kind of hegemonic explanatory system. And I've run into that in some of the reaction to my work, the people who just don't want it to be anything other than a reconfiguring of symbols.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a sufficient explanation. And the odd thing is the vehemence with which they insist that you shouldn't do anything else,
Hmm.
that doing anything else is wrong and dangerous. And anytime people start telling you why you shouldn't look for answers in novel ways, is a pretty good sign that you really ought to.
Well, and that considering that's like the entire first several chapters of this book, saying that there's a kind of cultural othering that's always happening. We always look to not those guys and not those girls, but this, you know. And yeah, what a
Mhm.
sociological function. Well, I want to be conscientious of our time, and I want to
Okay.
leave room for you to get to anything that we're leaving out. What feels like we're not tending?
Hmm. I actually feel like we pretty much covered everything, in between the last time we
I
talked and this time. I had, thought about different things I wanted to talk about, but I, I, well, okay, I'll talk about to go, I don't know, maybe I'm foolish, to talk a little more about parapsychology. Um, I mean, I wrote a paper about, a ball lightning phenomenon, and that was reported from a small town in Germany that I was studying. There was this fiery figure who appeared in the graveyard, and people came and they stared at it. This fiery thing, and it took on different forms. Sometimes it was kind of round and like a basket, and other times it was tall and it looked like a figure, but with no arms or legs. But it still had this sort of menacing sort of figure like aspect to it, and nobody knew what it was. And then people said, well, it started happening when this old woman died, and while she had been an exemplary woman and had led an exemplary life or a perfectly fine life, people began to think about things which had seemed a little shady, or in retrospect, she didn't always go to church and blah, blah,
Mhm.
blah. And pretty soon they thought she was a witch, and this was the devil warning them that she shouldn't have been buried in the communal graveyard, that this was a bad omen, that she should have been buried out in the woods with the other outcasts. And oh, and then oh yeah, and then it went in, and it went into her house, and they saw it move around in her house. And this was the devil. She was a witch, and this was the devil. And then the government, because this was in the mid 18th century, the government kind of tamped this down, that this was a diabolical illusion, that the woman was not a witch. She was just, people were making stuff up in retrospect. And this was the devil was trying to lead people astray, to get them to hate each other and vilify each other, and get this innocent thrown out of the grave unjustly. And this was the devil's work. And I said, well, but we don't think it was the devil's work. What do we think it was? Well, it sounds a lot like ball lightning. And the interesting thing about ball lightning is that nobody understands what ball lightning is or how it works. It does stuff that nothing should be able to do. There are various theories about it, but none of them really encompasses everything that's been reported about it. We don't really understand it, and yet it is, to a modern scientific, person, the most reasonable explanation for it, because it conforms in some important ways to the way that
Mhm.
ball lightning behaves. And um and so, but then I said, but ball lightning is we use it to explain phenomenon that seem too far out, and yet we don't really know why it works either. It's inexplicable. And there have been people who've claimed that it's a mass delusion, that it doesn't really exist, and whatever, but they're pretty much outvoted. It seems like the scientific consensus is there is this thing called ball lightning, and it happens, but nobody knows why. But it's better to explain something as ball lightning than something further out there, that we
Mhm.
can explain as a UFO. Oh, UFOs, it can't be a UFO. It must be ball lightning. It can't have been the devil doing something, because we know the devil doesn't exist and blah blah blah. So it must have been ball lightning. What's ball lightning? Well, I don't know. We don't really know, but you know we're more comfortable with it. We're more comfortable with that than we are with, something like the devil. But it's just each culture, each group, using an explanation which makes
Yeah.
sense to it. And anyway, so I am interested in that, the way people, favor certain explanations, and certain explanations fit with a complex of other explanations, and is therefore more comfortable than, in the early modern period, if you'd said ball lightning to somebody, they wouldn't have known what the world you were talking about,
Yeah.
and it would have seemed totally foreign, and yet the devil was a very familiar figure, and so to explain this thing as the devil, made sense to them. And anyway, that
Well,
was
yeah, it brings up the idea that we have these explanatory models, and we will always have explanatory models. And maybe I go a little Buddhist here, which is that any of our explanatory models aren't that thing.
hmm
And that,
the
that
map.
Jeff Greipel said something last time when I interviewed him. I said a comment about how we don't necessarily know what UFOs are. He said, and he studies this. This is his domain. He said, actually, I just take out the word necessarily. We don't know. We don't know, and nobody knows. Like there are these phenomena that happen that are. I think one of the things he would say is that consciousness, or our experience of our consciousness, is much weirder than we can ever fathom. And inherently, there are these mysterious aspects to the ways in which we live, and our religious traditions and the traditions outside of these, scientific paradigms have been the containers of these mysterious anomalous phenomena
hmm
that can't be reduced to that which can be reduced, which which is only part of it. And there we're back to this wonderful dynamic of the explainable and the unexplainable.
Yeah, well, it relates back, we were talking earlier about the way that visual and text depictions of magic kind of distorted our understanding of what it is. Um, Somebody wrote something. I wish it's one of those times, when you're taking lots of notes and it's like, well, I know I'm not really, I don't think I'm really going to need this, so I'm not going to bother writing it down and attributing
Sure.
it. But somebody said, he basically wrote a very well stated paragraph about how people will have this ineffable experience that's totally different. They just, and yet other people want to know, they want to tell other people, they want to communicate to other people, and so in order to communicate it, you have to sort of conventionalize it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you have to, it's, yeah, it's like, I remember I investigated a case that was purported to be about two, it was about lycanthropy. I was doing a paper on lycanthropy, and it was two women who turned themselves into birds.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read the case, it actually wasn't at all about them turning themselves into birds. It's that this guy had this altercation with these women, and then later he had this sort of visualization of these two spirit-like figures that sort of looked like the bodies of birds, but with no wings and no tails, but just, and they actually drew them in the document. And it was really the archivist who sort of made those into birds and described them as birds in the archival index. Whereas at the time, nobody was talking about them as birds. They were talking about them as this was the apparitions manifesting these witches who were after this guy, as he described it. And so it's like, like I said, this guy who wrote this paragraph that I wish to this day I had copied down and attributed. But the more you try to communicate it, the more you conventionalize it, and the more you conventionalize it, the more you distort it away from what was really unique about it. Well,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, away from what was unique about it, and towards things that can be understood and assimilated into people's larger construct of understanding and reality. And in the end, you can end up with something that's totally debased from the, like I think the witches, the conventionalized witch Sabbath was, the the outcome of a long series of things like that, where very different experiences. were gradually conventionalized and reconciled with each other and amalgamated into this cohesive, you know, thing that was supposed to be happening. And then people imagined that it really did, that really witches really did congregate out with the devil at the head of the and out on the campfire
Hmm.
and stirring their cauldron and stuff. And it was built out of many, many pieces that really did exist. But, but also out of experiences that can't be described. For example, this the young woman who had the peculiar pieces of grain from the teenagers who went out to the strawberry patch. She described going to the Heuberg. That was one of the conventional things, that witches flew to the Heuberg, the Hay Mountain, and
Hmm.
they had their ceremonies at the top of the mountain. And she talked about flying to the Heuberg. And then I think, well, we talk about getting high. Nobody thinks they actually fly up in the sky, but we
Hmm.
talk about
Hmm.
getting high, and there are all kinds of conventionalizations that we have of these experiences that are really ineffable and totally individual. And yet we try to describe them to each other, and so you end up with Yellow Submarine. Um,
Absolutely. Well, it's ineffable, right? And we've got to start closing out, Ed. But I'm
okay,
sorry that we
okay.
got to do that because we could roll forever. Um, I, I I think what you just said about how it's conventionalized and the ways in which, and we can study this, that anomalous or mysterious phenomena is conceptualized and communicated over time. That we can study, and we know for a
Hmm.
fact that you're writing out this timeline, and it's certainly what we now have narrativized in our religious and occult traditions. So thank you today for unpacking this. This has been a real
Oh,
treat, man. I'm grateful for your time.
oh, well, listen, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoy talking with you, and I'm happy to share what I understand and the extent to which it helps other people understand things differently, maybe a little better. I'm pleased for that.
It's
And
a
I'm happy
pleasure.
you're doing this, and thank you for inviting me to do it.
Yeah, thanks, man.